Hey everyone, it's Matt Carl, LeRoy Heritage Museum, and we got the camera out today, and we're going to take a ride over the mountain and talk about some local history as it pertains to Barclay Mountain. Hopefully this works out. I'm not going to go into great detail on a lot of things so that I can cover many different things. And so, let's see if we can get the camera adjusted here. So, we're driving up the mountain road coming out of LeRoy, and this road was built in the early 1870s. Hugh Holcomb, who had a store down in LeRoy, wanted to sell coal at his store. And he wanted to get a hold of some of the mines at Carbon Run, and he wanted to bring it down the mountain. The only problem with that is that the only way to get it down the mountain was a switchback road, which made it very difficult to get the coal to his store. So he got the contract to build the road up the mountain. As far as the Carbon Run area, the road might have gone slightly different direction at that time, but it's pretty close to what it is. And he managed the project. I believe the township paid for it. It said that they ended up paying much more than it would have cost under proper management, according to the records. So it's interesting how that went. But nevertheless, that is how this road got here. We're coming to the falls that come from Hawkins Pond, and these falls were the site of a major catastrophe, a dam break, back in the mid-1800s. That those falls are only there because there was a grist mill and a sawmill later on at the bottom of the mountain, and so a swamp at the top of the mountain was dammed up so that the water could gather there and create a better flow so that they could operate the mill using water power with a water wheel. And that's why those falls are there to start with. And those falls were also a problem because in the mid-1850s there was a dam break, and the water came rushing down over the mountain in the middle of the night. And the history tells about it sounding like a great roar, and people thought the end of the world had come, and they said trees and rocks and boulders and everything come rolling down over the mountain and caused damage down below, killed some animals and so on. And that was an interesting piece of history. So the original road that came up the mountain is still in existence, actually, so it's private now, but we're coming to the top of the mountain here, and off to the left, just before the first cabin that you come to on the left, there is a gated road, and just before the cabin, which you see right here, and it's a private road, but that road, it was the original switchback road that came up the mountain, and that's how you got up here before this road here was built. Ahead here on the left is the Jersey 3 Square cabin. That was originally built as a hotel for hunters by R.D. Kelly and his wife Lib, and they got it built using lumber from houses that they tore down at Lakeland, and unfortunately, because Art had a drinking issue, they weren't able to ever open the hotel, and so it got built, but it never opened. And of course, up here, just before you get to the Sunfish Pond Road, there's some hunting camps, and there are some farms up here, and some of these are original houses from Ville's farms, and the Chapel family is the family that lived up here and farmed up here. And basically, what happens when you farmed up here back over 100 years ago, in the late 1800s, is that your animals just roamed wild in the woods, and you didn't build fences. There wasn't really any need to, and so they could wander through the woods and find all sorts of things to eat, and maybe you might have to go out and gather them up every so often, but that's the way that worked. So we turned left when we got to Sunfish Pond Road, and now we're heading out across the mountain. Of course, there's been a lot of natural gas drilling going on up here, so it looks a lot different than it used to. But my object here is to point out some of the interesting historical places along the road here. One of the questions I get a lot is people wondering where specific places were at, either specific towns or specific buildings within those towns here on the mountain. And there's really no easy way to answer that. You have to be literally taken there and understand where you're at. It's hard to give directions to these places because everything is woods, and there are not a lot of landmarks. So maybe by doing this video, this will give you an opportunity to see some of the, at least, general places of where history was made on the mountain. We're doing this late in the day, so the shadows are long across the road. As we drive out through this area, we're on the way to Carbon Run right now, but long before you get to Carbon Run, there are areas out here that were strip mined by the Mott family, and then the Mott family had other mines as well, and different members of the family had other mines as well at Carbon Run. Up here on the right, as we go by, is the entrance to where the ice mine used to be, and the ice mine is blasted shut now, so there's no access to it. That was owned by Wesley Mott, and it maintained a temperature year-round inside, and so there was always ice available there. So if you needed ice for your refrigerator before electricity existed, you could come get ice there. Normally people got their ice in this particular area from the lake up in Canton, or sometimes they came out here to Mud Pond, which we'll be passing the road to, and you could cut ice out of the lake there, out of the pond there. Of course, this is spring, so the roads are bad, and so we're bouncing around quite a bit. We're just entering Franklin Township, and we're just entering Carbon Run. To my left, as I is a road, and to my right is a parking space, so you'll know where that is when you get to that. Of course, out the road to the left is where the large mines were when the original company came to Carbon Run, and out the road to my right is where a lot of the smaller mines in later years were located. So the town of Carbon Run is located right next to the creek that's also called Carbon Run, which is down over the hillside right here. They've been doing some work to run the pipeline up here, and when you get into Carbon Run, the way you know that you're in Carbon Run is that there's a concrete foundation. There's a truck coming, so I'm going to back up. So I'm in a pull-off area, and before I continue talking about that foundation, right in this pull-off area where I'm at right now, there's a stone foundation right along the road. That's the boarding house for the Mott Coal Company in later years. That's the foundation for that. There was a boarding house actually to my left as I'm sitting here, further up, which was the original boarding house. And you can just barely make out the foundations for both of them, but they're mostly covered in brush and so on, so it's difficult to do that. So we'll continue on. So right here's the concrete foundation, and that is the milk house that went with a farm. It was part of a large barn that sat right here, but it was a farm, and milk was produced here in the early 1900s on this farm and sold to the residents down at Lakeland. So we're right up over the mountain from Lakeland when we're here at Carbon Run. And there was a road that went down over the mountain from here as well. Now, to my right and left, there are stone foundations in the brush, and a lot of them are covered with briars, so they're very difficult to see. But when you go down this straight stretch through the middle of Carbon Run, on my right there are about 4 or so rows of stone foundations of houses, and then on my left there is 1 row. There are some other miscellaneous foundations around too. This town had a church in it, had schools and so on. Carbon Run was the first coal mining town to go down. The others followed later on, but this is the oldest town, so there's not a whole lot to see in Carbon Run. And as we get to the end of this straight stretch, again on your left and right you see different places where mines have settled and caved in and been left behind over the years. Carbon Run was also the place where there was an airplane accident, and down in the museum we have a piece from that airplane back in the early 1900s. An airplane that was headed toward Elmira. It was a military plane, and it was a wooden framed plane. Got caught in fog and didn't know where he was going. And back then he didn't have instruments in the plane, so he was just navigating by vision basically. And he got into this area. He saw the mountain here. He circled around and tried to land right there in Carbon Run, and he ended up crashing. He landed pretty fine, but he ended up hitting a haystack and ripped his wings off. So we're at the entrance to the new well pad at Carbon Run. Just to give you some bearings of where we're at here. Now, as we come around this curve here, we're at a part called Halfway Bridge, and the LeRoy Coal Company was set up here. They had their Lone Star mine as well as several other mines here, and you'll see a few different foundations, including some leftovers to the boarding house on the left side of the road. The boarding house had burned down, and Paul Percival, who was a small child at that time, his mother and father were running the boarding house, and his mother died in that fire. There's an open shaft off to the left there. And he also had Gunton's coal mine. W.B. Gunton was a coal miner, owned a coal company that operated here, and he sent his coal down to Lakeland to help operate the chemical plant, and also sold coal to the railroad as well. And the LeRoy Coal Company also had a track that went down to a different place down in Lakeland, and they sent their coal down there as well. And there are literally just innumerable stories along this road at different places. If you stop and really walk around and look at things, you could talk about all sorts of things. But again, I'm just trying to hit the important parts. As we approach Barkley, there was a picnic grounds on the left out into the woods. At different places here on the mountain, the road actually goes a different direction than it originally did. And so the picnic grounds was a little bit further back in the woods, probably. The exact spot is hard to identify now. Many, many years ago, there was a marker identifying where it was located, but that's gone. But nevertheless, the picnic grounds is where a lot of celebrations were held, and weddings and picnics and so on, but also reunions that were held at Barkley in later years in the 1920s, 30s area. The picnic grounds was one place that was a popular place to come to for residents that were coming back to visit the place where they had lived for so many years. So we're coming up to the town of Barkley, and off to the right is where the Berkeley Cemetery was, and that is a gated road we'll just drive out to the gate here. You can still walk out to the cemetery. It's not off limits by any means. You just can't drive out there now, and it is on state game lands as well. So people often ask, where in the world was the town of Barclay? Well, we're here at the gate to the cemetery. We're actually on one of the streets for Barclay, and so there would have been houses on both sides of this road going out to the cemetery, and the cemetery would basically be the end of the town. And of course, within the cemetery is the Catholic church, which you can find the stone foundation for right in the front of the cemetery. If you dig really deep, you can find some foundations off in the woods along these roads, but it's very difficult to find, and it's often really muddy, covered with briars, and pretty much an absolute nightmare. And when you find things, it's really impossible almost to identify what those things are. But when you're driving on these roads, you are right in the middle of town. So we're going to turn around. Down past that gate is where the water treatment place is, and when that water treatment place was put in, there were some foundations that got covered up there or moved. So if you just envision right along the road here there being a number of different buildings. We come back out to the end of the cemetery road where it meets the mountain road, and right across the road here from us is where one of the mines, the major mines for Barclay, was located, right over there. And you can get an idea if you walk back in there. You can kind of see where it is now. Of course, you can't enter anything. All of those were closed a long time ago. And then further down the road here to the left, there's another one of the major coal mines is also located there. So we're gonna drive down through Barclay, and then we're gonna turn around and come back. So we're at the intersection where the street sign says foot of the plains. By the way, that sign is not right. It should be foot of plain is what it was called. Plains, we're not talking about a land feature. We're talking about the plain road that went down over the hill. That coal was let down over the hill, and in that case it's Plane. And so the town at the bottom was called Foot of Plain. So now that we're driving up through on both sides of the road, you're in the town of Barclay as you're driving up. Now we're on the road that would take you down to Franklandale if you kept going on it. We're not going to go that far. And off on both sides there were buildings. Occasionally you can find a foundation. What you have to remember in this area is the road that is here now was not exactly where the road always was. And you can see it best if you look at aerial maps and LiDAR maps and so on. You can see how the road kind of swerves back and forth from where it had originally been, mainly to straighten out the road for the most part. This pull-off area here, as we come through Barclay, you can pull off there. If you go back that road, that will take you to where the coal chutes were. If you go all the way, if you turn off left on the way back there, you can find another of the coal mining towns. out through there. I'm looking at the road here and trying to not kill myself. And another question I always get is about another cemetery that's unmarked that is out in this area. And yes, there is a cemetery. I'm not going to talk about where it's at, just for the protection of it. But sometimes I've been asked through the gas companies to know where those places are, and they have been notified. But they are not intending to come that direction, is my understanding from having been up here with them. So we're going to turn around right here. If you continue out that road there, you come to two different roads, which are the far end of Barclay, which were two towns, Dublin and Graydon, out there. But two roads that you'll see there now is Fall Creek Road and Long Valley Road. Fall Creek was the town that I said back when we were coming out this road, that if you walked out to the gate, which is now on our left, Fall Creek is out in that direction. Long Valley was another one of the coal mining towns, and there's not a whole lot to Long Valley left, because of the Long Valley in many later years from when it was originally in operation, Long Valley was strip mined, and so a lot of what you could see of Long Valley was destroyed. But there are a few things out there. You can see the Store Foundation, and you can see the place where the inclined plane for Long Valley was. There were 3 inclined planes up here on the mountain, not just the one at Barclay. There were 3 of them. Long Valley had its own to send its coal down over, and Long Valley was the town that lasted the longest of the coal mining towns anyway. And so they had their own access to the railroad to get their coal down to market. So we're coming back to the intersection here in Barclay. Instead of heading back towards the cemetery, we're going to turn left now and go down foot of the plain road. And when you start down this road, then on your left are piles of what look like orange rock, slag, some people might call it. And when we get down here, I'll pull in. These are the culm banks, C-U-L-M, and this is material that was dumped when they brought coal out of the mines. This was a material that was not worth anything, and so they would dump it. It was not orange though when it came out of the mines. It was black, but this would spontaneously combust, and after it would burn, it would turn this orangey colored rock. I'm not going to get out of the truck. This is strictly a driving tour today, but down over the bank here, it's pretty fascinating if you hike down there. It's a pretty good walk to get around and down there, but if you get down there, you can see where the coal chutes were at, and all the big mines emptied into the coal chutes that were down there. And there's basically a loop there that went around a creek. The creek is called Coal Run right there, but there's a little loop that they brought the coal cars in, and they would load coal into there from the mines, send it down the chute, fill up the cars. The cars would then come out, and we're going to come out and back out of here and turn left. We're going by a waterfall there to give you some bearings. The cars would come out right here on this curve. You can kind of see where it came across. It's deteriorated pretty good, but you can see. And then the cars would go off across down here to the top of the incline plane for Barclay. This road up ahead, straight ahead, which looks like a log road, which is what it basically is. But if you were to walk out there, I believe it's gated, but if you were to walk out there about a half a mile or so, you come to the top of the inclined plane, and you can see the foundations there. We're going to continue down over the hill, headed toward the foot of the plane, and where the coal came out at. By the way, Lehrer Heritage Museum, we did walking tours of a lot of these sites for about 12 years. A lot of people ask, are you still doing your tours, and when do you have them, and so on. We stopped doing them a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, because of the tick problem here on the mountain was the primary reason. But we also wanted to start focusing on what now has become Barclay Mountain Heritage Day, and so we're glad we did that. We've been able to expose a lot more people to Barclay Mountain history through the event than we did on the walking tours. We might have had between 30 and 50 people on the walking tours, which is about all that you can take on a walking tour and be able to cover a lot of ground. So I personally like to do walking tours, and everyone really enjoyed them, and hopefully we'll come back and be able to do them again in the future. Maybe if we're lucky here, as we drive through the woods, we'll see some wildlife crossing the road. We're here late in the day, and I think this is a better time actually to do this anyway, because it's easier to see. You don't have the sun bearing down on the road. We are coming down to foot of plain. Off to my left, as you come down over here, it turns into Fall Creek, and there are Fall Creek mines there as well, and some of them, at least the last I knew, you could still go in. A lot of the mines are being gated shut. Because bats are living in there, and so the Game Commission is doing that now, and also it protects people from getting injured by going into the mines. So we're coming down here to Foot of Plain, which was a town, and the road sign you see, it's right there. So when you're sitting here, we're at Foot of Plain. Here at Foot of Plain is where the coal came down off the mountain. The cars from the incline would go down and would go on the railroad and then be sent on down to Towanda from here. But there was a small settlement here as well. The Lewis Brothers Lumber Company later on in the late 1800s were sending their lumber down over the plain to this as a shipping location as well. And when the Barclays first came up here to start Lakeland, they came here to Foot of Plain first and had a store set up at this location before they made their way into Lakeland. They were waiting for the town to get started and the buildings to start getting built. So we're gonna turn right and we're headed out to Lakeland. But here on my left, as we come out through here, is where the incline plane comes down. Off to my left, that was my right. Off to my left is clearings, which gives you an idea of where the town was at. And the Susquehanna New York Railroad would have been built up here on the left, and when they were building that onto Lakeland. Up to this point, the Barclay Railroad that was here before only came as far as Foot of Plain. There wasn't any more need to run the railroad further up into the mountain in the direction we're now going. The Barclay Railroad was specifically to get the coal from Barclay, so the foot of the plain was right there, and they brought the coal down to the Barclay Railroad, and that was taken down. Now, however, they had to build the Susquehanna New York Railroad up over the mountain in order to get supplies, and building materials, and everything that was needed to get to the place where Lakeland, the lumber town, would be built. So now we're up into around 1901, 1902. We're just passing Minersville Road right here. And if you drive down Minersville Road, you see where the railroad bed was, right along the Schrader Creek. We're going to continue up over the hillside here, though, on our way to Lakeland. A lot of these roads we drive on now are Ccc Roads. They were built after Lakeland closed down and the Ccc camp came in and was built at Lakeland. The men did an innumerable number of projects all over the mountain, and one of those projects was building roads. And so a lot of the roads that we really take for granted now as we drive over the mountain, many of them didn't even exist before the Ccc was here. In most cases, you didn't just drive up over the mountain to Lakeland in a vehicle back then. You had to take the railroad to get to Lakeland. Now, in later years, there were some other options. You could get up over the hill with a wagon and horses to Carbon Run, but really wasn't easy no matter what you did. Some really nice views right here. They've clear cut the trees in this area, or I wouldn't say clear cut, they've selectively cut, but the Game Commission has done work with clearing out areas for animal habitat, and so they're not just clearing arbitrarily just to make money, although I'm sure it helps, but they are helping the habitat out here by doing what they do. So we're going to bring this back to the middle. Again, we're in springtime here, so the road is full of potholes right now. it's interesting to think about when you drive over the mountain here through these trees and see these mountainsides, that when Lakeland was finished, these mountainsides that you're looking at were all clear cut. You didn't see trees like this anywhere. There was no such thing as selective cutting, like I mentioned back there at the time. And that's how all lumber operations were back then. It was about making the money, and there wasn't really any thought of conservation at that time. And so it's amazing when you think about what this must have looked like when it was totally clear cut. And right now, because of the clearing out that you see along the road here that the Game Commission is having done, you kind of get an idea of really what the views would have been like with the mountain completely clear cut like this. So we're coming to Lakeland. We just passed where the LeRoy Coal Company tipple area was, or the tracks would have crossed. And you know you're entering Lakeland when you get to this parking area right here, which I'm not going to pull down any further, but we're right along the Schrader Creek. And then right off to my right where I'm sitting is the abandoned railroad bridge for the Susquehanna and New York Railroad. And that was the entrance to town on this end of the town for the railroad. So we'll get back out here on the road. You can see the railroad bridge down in the trees there. So Gunton's coal mine, I mentioned earlier, sent coal down over the hillside and down here into Lakeland, and his coal came out here off to my left. As we come up around the curve here was a tipple where the coal would be loaded on rail cars, either for the railroad or sent down to the chemical plant. We're driving up around what used to be one of the main streets in Lakeland, and on both sides of the road here were houses back at that time. And if you look at the maps of Lakeland as it was when it was a town, you can decipher what road you were on as you drive through here. You'll see some of the major streets in town, and really all that you see for the houses in this part of Lakeland, which were in the part where a lot of the sawmill workers lived, they're just outhouse holes that basically identify. Now I will say, as we come into here, that all of this is private property, so please don't go off the road unless you have asked permission of a property owner. As we come around the curve here, the doctor's office would have been here on the right. The hotel would have been here on the left. Right here where Cougar Lane is, out in that direction, where that cabin is where the store was, right on that foundation of that house. And also the railroad depot. If we come around the curve here, to my left is the ball field, off in that direction. To my right would start, you would have had back there at the corner, the post office, the Barclay House, the Baptist Church, some more houses in between here. And then when you get to this first cabin here on the right, you just past that is the foundation for the Methodist Church. And then you have the foundation for the school right up in this area. Out to your left as you go by Pop's place, you would have a boarding house out there, and the Hub and Veneer plant was out in that direction. There was also another boarding house to my right as we come around another curve right here. And then you would start seeing off to the left in the open valley out here you would start seeing the drying sheds for the stave mill, and those long sheds that you see in the pictures of Lakeland, that's where those would have been located. Those are drying sheds for the staves that were running through, and they had just been cut and were running through to dry out in order to be shipped. To my right here would have been a long row of houses called stave mill houses. There's a rabbit going across the road, and it's our first wildlife of the day. So the stave mill row was there with those houses for workers. We're going to be coming back and going up this road ahead. That goes to Sunfish Pond, but we're going to run down this direction first. This was another street called Palmer Street that continued on straight and went down to the stave mill. I forgot to mention the sawmill that was back there where I said Cougar Lane was. That was back in the trees there in the kindling wood mill. They're back out of view, which you can't see from here. We're going by Hugo Hideaway, which was where the stave mill was located. And we're right on the railroad right now, where the passenger railroad came around the curve and went on through Lakeland. So if you were a passenger coming up from Williamsport, you would have been coming from this direction. Off to my left was a stave mill log pond. So right here at this intersection, the railroad split, and one line went one direction for passenger service and the other went to the right for the stave mill. Now here's the new bridge at Lakeland, which is interesting because I haven't been up here since it was done. But what a huge improvement to get across the Schrader Creek here, and I'm sure the cabin owners are happy about it. This is the dead-end road, by the way, if you drive out here. We're going to drive out to the end here, and as we go through this area, when you cross the creek, first of all, you're in a different township. You're in Overton Township now. And right as we drive through the trees here, off to the left was the chemical plant. That was the last plant to be operating in Lakeland. And then the further we go back through the trees here, off to the left, there's a large clearing, and this was the drying yard, or this was the yard for hardwood to come in and be stacked. Would have been shipped in from the woods, and it would be stacked out here to dry because it would be going through the chemical plant where it would be burned up to be used for all sorts of things, charcoal and other chemicals. So when you get past the last cabin out here, and then it says, "Welcome to State Game Lands, hunt safely." All of that was private land that we just drove through. It's not a place to go walking around unless you have permission. Now we're in game lands. And when you get out to this point, here we're driving through a line of trees. You'll see on the right side there, and also on the left. And you're driving right down through the center of the CCC camp at this point. And there are foundations. There was a mess hall over on my left, a recreation hall on my left. The company office was over on the right, the doctor's office. And then when we get to this point right here, you'll see, if you look closely, a line of trees that kind of, it no longer runs parallel to the road, but it crosses the road all the way over. It's hard to see with all the brush, but that's what it does. And under the trees, you'll find the foundation blocks for the barracks buildings that were out here. They're concrete buried in the ground, but that gives you an idea where the barracks buildings were located out here. And when you look in the pictures of the camp, look at those, you'll see the line of barracks buildings, so that kind of gives you some bearings as to where you're at when you're out here. A lot of the times the CCC camps would plant a row of trees where their barracks buildings and where their camp was, so that in later years they could identify where they had been located. And so this comes to a dead end when it gets out through here. I'm not sure that we're going to go all the way. The road's getting pretty bad. But this was all camp as it went all the way to the end of the valley here. And there were sports fields and all sorts of things, recreation areas and things out here for the men that were working here. And then when you get out here, there's a gate, so you can't go any further from this point. So we're going to turn around. We're going to head back to the road that goes up to Sunfish Pond next. One thing about the CCC camp is it's hard to make out where all of the barracks buildings are, because unfortunately the Schrader Creek has continued to wash out along the bank, and a lot of footers have washed down the creek. So unfortunately time has taken its toll on all forms of history here in Lakeland. And again, this area, the last tour we did, walking tour on the mountain, was here in Lakeland, and right here in this part of town, I had ticks all over me when I came out of the woods, and so did a lot of other people. And so that is what made us come to the conclusion that we would stop those for a while. But when you drive out through this road, back where we just were at, in the summertime, in the spring, you'll see flowers blooming, because there had been flowers planted along the areas where the barracks buildings were, and where the office and so on. Those were all planted in landscaped beds at one time. There were sidewalks that went back and forth to different buildings, and so you can still get an idea of how it was laid out. Back on some flat ground now again. Again, I can't say it enough. We're back on private property now. This whole valley of Lakeland is private property. There's a long story behind that, which we won't talk about here. But we're coming up to the new bridge again. There was a bridge here that was actually a railroad bridge when Lakeland was in operation, and it was the only access really to this side of the creek, major access anyway, and that is where everyone could come across, and you could bring the coal cars over there for the plant. We'll turn so we can see the bridge here, which we can't. But this road I just turned on is the SNNY. There's the bridge. This is the SNNY. Off to my right, if I turn and look over in that direction. The SNNY rail bed goes off in that direction, and it's usually gated, so we're not going to go down that way. But when you're on this road, this gives you an idea of how and where the railroad came in. It would come right to this curve, and if when it got to this point, if it was a train with logs for the stave mill, we're right on the rail bed right now, they would turn right here to the right, about where this telephone pole is, and that would take them out around the log pond for the stave mill. Or if it was a passenger train, they would continue straight as we are, so that they could wind up down into the middle of town. So right here we're on rail bed until we get up here to this curve, and then when we turn the curve, we'll be on an actual street in town. This rail bed would have actually continued on straight down through town from this curve. Now it's someone's lawn in that direction. So we're headed back up over here, and the stave mill superintendent's house was up over the hillside up in this direction. It's a log house which existed for many years, up until very recently, really. It was torn down and replaced. So we're headed up this road now. Now, when Lakeland existed, this road didn't exist. There might have been a pathway, but you don't see this road in the pictures on this end of town. You don't see this road as existing at that time. This was built by the Ccc camp because they needed to get up to Sunfish Pond. They were doing a lot of work up at Sunfish, and they needed a direct route to get up there. And in addition to just, they wanted to build roads around the mountain for recreational purposes, and that was the whole point of being here. Also, basically, fire roads as well. Not just recreation, but they wanted to provide a way for firemen to get in here if it was necessary. We used to have a fire tower up on Kellogg Mountain that would be for sighting fires, and we don't have that so much anymore, fire towers. But there are a lot of easier access, I think, to woodland area than there used to be, thanks to, at least in this area, what was done by the CCC. So the gate was open, so we're going to head to Sunfish Pond. When we come up out of Lakeland, you will come to a small brick building, and there it is. This brick building was built by the CCC, whose camp was right down over the hill we just went through, and it was built by the CCC for blasting materials and so on, so they could keep it. They had to keep it away from the camp, that type of material. And then also where we're at here, down, let's see, down through the trees there a little way is where a telephone line comes up over the hill, and it runs to Sunfish Pond, and then it runs down to LeRoy. And that was built by the CCC originally to provide a means of communication between the camp in the 1930s and other towns, so Towanda and other places. So they ran it to Sunfish Pond, and then they ran it down over the hill into LeRoy. And actually, when you are in LeRoy, you can see the trees cut out that goes up over the hill, out of LeRoy up towards Sunfish Pond, and that was put in by the CCC. That's was originally a telephone service line that ran up over the hill, ran to Sunfish Pond, to the gamekeeper's house, which is why they went to Sunfish Pond to start with. The game refuge was there at the time, and the refuge keeper had a house where he lived at Sunfish Pond year-round, and he needed communication as well, because you couldn't get off the mountain too well in the wintertime. So you had access for the CCC camp to communication, and you had access for the game refuge keeper's house. So this road now that we're taking up to Sunfish Pond is totally built by the CCC. The road's a little bit rough this time of year, but certainly nothing like it used to be. As many of us remember, this road was impassable for a number of years. It was rebuilt not that long ago, and has been a great thing to be able to access Lakeland from this direction as well, or Sunfish Pond from this direction as well, if you want to. So we're going to be approaching Sunfish Pond pretty soon. And Sunfish Pond had some coal mining activity that went on around the early 1900s, into the 19-teens era. And some of those mines are still around. And in one case, they mined right back underneath the pond, which is an interesting thing. A lot of the mining operations that were started here, that company went on over and worked in the Carbon Run area later on. But what Sunfish Pond has been most recognized as was a game refuge in the past. Of course, Sunfish Pond existed way back into the 1800s. Someone suggested once that it was a man-made pond. That's not the case. You can find references back into the mid-1800s of people coming to Sunfish Pond for picnics. And so it's always been a recreational kind of a place. But it was a game refuge back in the early 1900s. There was a refuge keeper's house over on the other end of the pond from where we are. And he lived here year-round, and the purpose was to propagate the types of wildlife that they wanted to be here, and to get rid of the kind of wildlife they didn't want to be here. And he would have kind of a rough life, because you had to live up here in the wintertime all year round. If you're kind of a loner kind of a person, that would have been a perfect job. But if you had a family and your kids lived up here, it would probably be pretty hard on the kids, because you didn't just run off the mountain when there was heavy snow. You were pretty much up here by yourself, so that could be difficult. So when we come around Sunfish Pond, there were actually, in the early 1900s, there were some hunting camps that were up here, even when the game refuge was here. And hunting was, and still is, very important up here, but hunting was very important going back over a century up here. There were hunting camps where guys, especially from down in the LeRoy area, would come up. When we come over to this end of the pond where the dock is, and then the area where trailer camping normally is held, right up in this area here, where the playground is and so on, this is where the refuge keeper's house was. So we're going to turn up around the driveway here, and when you drive up here, you get up here to kind of a flat area where there's stone sticking out of the ground right here. And right here where my truck is parked is actually where the first main refuge keeper's house was. There was actually a shack here before that, but the first main refuge keeper's house was built on that site. And then this shed over here that's used by the county now for maintenance up here, what went with that refuge keeper's house. So that's an original refuge keeper's building. And then right here where the playground is, right off to my right here, was where the second refuge keeper's house is, which was the nicer house that was later built. And right here on this playground building right here, carved into those shutters, is a design, kind of a pine tree, hemlock tree, whatever design. And that is the same design that was on the shutters for the refuge keeper's house. That's kind of a little detail that was done with the playground. I was involved when the playground got done with bringing some historical features into it, and so that was one of them. It's kind of a nod to the refuge keeper's house that was here. So now we're leaving the park. Again, the road now to my left, which we're not going to go out, it's called Ccc Road, and again built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and that leads out to Cold Spring, which was another town, a much older town, lumbering town, but not specifically lumbering. There's a lot of farming went on there as well. A lot of things have changed, though, along the Sunfish Pond Road because of pipelines that have gone in, natural gas, well pads. So not everything looks quite the same anymore, but some of the more important things are still here, including the planted trees that you see off here to the left. The line of trees that along both sides of the road coming up here, those were planted many years ago. This is what we're going through right now. A lot of trees on the mountain were planted by the CCC, by the way. I once had an interesting discussion, I guess, with someone online that wanted to make the point that the CCC didn't replant all the trees and didn't repropagate the mountain, that the mountain started growing all its trees back on its own. Certainly, nature took over and grew its own trees after the lumber period was over. But when you look in the CCC reports, the CCC planted thousands and thousands and thousands of trees. We're right here at another relatively new well pad on the Sunfish Pond Road. They planted thousands and thousands of trees and certainly got the ball rolling. They reintroduced wildlife. I already mentioned they built roads, they did drainage and all sorts of things up here. So while nature did take over eventually and start to fill in, the CCC did an amazing amount of work that really got things back to the way they should have been. And I think a lot of what we see today, although of course much more has grown and it's been cut and regrown, you have to acknowledge that the CCC did amazing work, and really we wouldn't have the mountain as it is today if it wasn't for them. I mean, we certainly wouldn't have roads. They took care of drainage and things that had just been overlooked during the lumber era. So we're back at the end of Sunfish Pond Road, and we have made a complete loop. We're back on the mountain road going down to LeRoy.